Good morning, good afternoon, and welcome everyone to today's webinar entitled The Epidemiology of Connectional Silence in Serious Illness Conversations. I'm Andrew Andresco, Project Coordinator for Transforming Chaplaincy, and we are delighted you could all join us. Some housekeeping instructions off the top. You are listening in using your computer speaker system by default and are muted. Should you have any technical questions regarding your audio or visual, please type those into the chat box located in the platform's dashboard. You will have the opportunity to submit text questions for our presenters by typing your questions into the questions pane of the control panel that's located at the side of your screen. You may send in your questions at any time during the presentation. We will collect these and hope to address them during the Q&A session at the end of today's presentation. And with that, I'd like to introduce Dr. George Fitchett, Director of Transforming Chaplaincy.
Hey, thanks, Andy. Friends, I just want to say how excited I am about the webinar today. Really grateful for Dr. Gramling, Dr. Sanders joining us to kind of share their expertise with us. And I want to express my gratitude to Paul Galschut. As you all know, Paul is a chaplain at M Health Fairview and the University of Minnesota in the Twin Cities, and we're really delighted, grateful for Paul for your work as the convener of Transforming Chaplaincy's Hospice and Spiritual Care, Palliative Care Research Network. Paul, thanks for organizing this webinar. I'm going to turn it over to you.
All right. Thank you so much, George, for your constant leadership, and I'm going to join that excitement wave with you. Thanks again, friends, for joining us here today, and for all those who are registered. But a special thanks to the presenter and discussant that I'll introduce in just a moment. Next slide, Andy, please. So if you were part of the network, you probably saw that I had indicated that today was to have been a doubleheader for me. But in my beloved state of Minnesota, however, it is a bit cold and a bit snowy in weather, so it's been pushed to tomorrow. So I had to take my twins hat off, and but I still stayed with the fact that most of Major League Baseball is having their opening day. So we'd love to have you make an impact with us in the Hospice Palliative Spiritual Care Research Network. It's free. We call it closed because we don't advertise, but we'd love to give you a link so you can connect with us so that we can share some peer-reviewed literature and be able to have events just like this with Dr. Gramling and Dr. Sanders, where we can even explore possibilities for research and coordinate that among each other. Next slide, please. So as we try to step into this realm of technology, here's a QR code. So in case somebody has their phone available and you want to do it that, we would love to have you slide into our network and come home with us and be a part of that time and space. Also want to mention that we're going to play this baseball theme just a little bit more. I asked our presenter and discussant if they would be willing to talk about their, or I mean not talk about, but we're going to name their, if they were to be Major League players walking up to the plate, what their walk-up songs would be. And let's start with our presenter. Next slide, please, Andy. We are privileged to have Dr. Bob Gramling with us. He is the Holly and Bob Miller Chair in Palliative Medicine and the tenured professor of family medicine at the University of Vermont. He is the principal investigator of the Vermont Conversation Lab. I suppose there is a bit of conservation also involved with that, perhaps. Please check it out on their website. It's easy to find. He is a part of more than 100 plus peer-reviewed publications. I think for any of us who are brand new to this research work, we hope at least at one point in our life to be funded by any organization. But Bob, this is pretty impressive. It's like an avalanche of goodness. So Bob has been funded by the National Institutes for Health, the National Science Foundation, the National Palliative Care Research Center, the Greenwald Bioethics Foundation, and the American Cancer Society. He's an undergraduate degree from Colby College, where I found out he also played some soccer. He has his Doctor of Medicine from Dartmouth, his Doctor of Science in Epidemiology from the Boston University School of Public Health. I'm going to save your walk-up song for after we introduce Dr. Sanders here. Next slide, please, Andy. So yeah, again, Dr. Justin Sanders, privileged to have you with us serving as our discussant today. He is the Cappy and Eric M. Flanders Chair of Palliative Care and an Associate Professor in the Department of Family Medicine at McGill University. He recently moved from the Dana-Farber Cancer Institute from Harvard Medical School and Ariadne Labs. His research and teaching activities focus on the intersection of culture, communication, and serious illness with the goal of promoting equity and authentic healing relationships for all those affected by serious illness. Dr. Sanders, Justin, it's a privilege to have you among us. And Dr. Sanders is going to share his walk-up song later on in our presentation when he comes on as the discussant. But for now, as I turn it over to Dr. Bob Gramling, folks, if you can hear it on the outside, I can see clearly now from the hothouse flowers, so take note of that. Everybody, thank you for being here today. Dr. Bob Gramling. Thank you, Bob.
Paul, thank you very much. That was just lovely. And for those who look up that song, you got to listen to it almost all the way through till it really ramps up, and then you'll see how it really gets you, gives you that goosebumps. Thank you for having me, and to George and to Andy for the invitation. And Andy, thank you for managing the slides and such today. I'm very appreciative for that. So I look forward to hearing this wonderful group's feedback. So I'm going to try to be efficient with my presentation and hopefully clear, and be ready to hear either today or offline your thoughts about places we can take this and how to do this to work better. So the epidemiology of connectional silences is the title today, and thanks, Andy. Next one. And I have no partnerships or conflicts with industry for this talk. Next, please. But I am conflicted in the sense that I get to be here, and I'm just one of a vibrant lab of people who make each other better. And I just wanted to acknowledge that I get a chance to do the speaking, but this work comes from a real lot of people, and I'd like just to acknowledge that for a moment. So I'm presenting today some evidence that arises from a palliative care cohort study. So, for some context, palliative care, many of you are certainly familiar with palliative care, if not most or all. And I use the national consensus definition to describe it. I find it useful for the things we think about. But palliative care means patient and family-centered care that optimizes quality of life by anticipating, preventing, and treating suffering. Next slide, please. And Eric Cassell provides a useful definition. This one I find pragmatically useful for jumping into concepts of what suffering is. And in his 1982 paper, he says suffering is experienced by persons, not merely bodies, and has its source in the challenges that threaten the intactness of the person as a complex social and psychological entity. Next, please, Andy. So I'll give you a second to think about what this is. We won't take a poll because so these are crayons. So over the last 100 years, children have, well, or all of us who use crayons have a lot more choices. And so do people who are seriously ill. And a lot of those choices feel like big differences, and maybe they are, but they also might be very small variations on a theme. And Eric Cassell, next slide, goes on to say that failure to understand the nature of suffering can result in medical intervention that, though technically adequate, not only fails to relieve suffering, but becomes a source of suffering itself. Next slide, please. So where are we with understanding this thing we call palliative care as an intervention? So a few things are pretty solid. One is that consultation with a specialty interprofessional palliative care team is associated with improved quality of life among people who are seriously ill by a few different definitions of that. And that those results, that improved quality of life is pretty durable. It's not a transient type of outcome. We also know that the palliative care workforce is not big enough to scale to the seriously ill population out there. And so a lot of the work right now is trying to understand what are the ingredients? What is it that's happening that we want to try to replicate, that we want to try to scale? And a lot of indirect evidence and some direct evidence supports the hypothesis that it's something about these decision-making conversations, or conversations where you're navigating at least what suffering means in context to the choices before you medically. And so that's the context for this conversation. And one of the things that we see as a challenge for communication science Andy. Next slide, please. As I pointed out in a 2017 study in JAMA Internal Medicine, thanks, Andy, you can, next slide, is that if I were to ask all of you, what makes a good conversation? If I want to try to understand, what are the types of conversations or what are the characteristics of those conversations that improve quality of life, you're probably all going to say it depends. And it does. Now, epidemiologically, that becomes a context, content, interaction question, much like genes and environments. To understand what happens in a conversation that's valuable and useful and healthful for people depends on the cultural and situational and other factors in which that conversation lives. To study that, we need to be able to access large variability in observations, large samples, representative of many different cultural backgrounds, speaker types, decisional contexts, etc. But we face some barriers. Now, one of them is that the traditional approaches to measuring conversations are quite cumbersome. They're time intensive, they're good, but it's very hard to do very large sample multi-site studies in any efficient or reasonably effective way from a financial perspective. So this group also recommends a little bit of some places to start and characterizes, next slide please, what is it in serious illness conversations that might be the places to start when we think about measurement. And this quote I find pretty useful is that clinicians engaging in conversations about serious illness have three primary tasks: establishing connection, eliciting values, goals, and preferences, and delivering information. Now, there may be more, and there may not necessarily be this sweet sequence. As everyone here knows, conversations are messy, they're not linear. But they start with this concept of establishing connection. And we hypothesize in our group that that is a fundamentally necessary step or piece to really achieve what conversations can do for people when they're seriously ill and vulnerable and needing to navigate what's before them. Now, it might be intuitively obvious to this group, but I find this next slide, this definition by Dr. Bolmsjo and their team, this concept of existential loneliness. I think this is kind of a special type of suffering that people are experiencing when they're acutely ill, interacting with the healthcare environment and being presented with options for their care. This existential loneliness can be understood as the immediate awareness of being fundamentally separated from other people and from the universe, primarily through experiencing oneself as mortal and, especially when in crisis, experiencing not being met, communicated with at a deep human, authentic level. So establishing connection, the thing that's lacking, the thing that's missing from human interactions in the concepts of existential loneliness becomes a fundamentally important thing. And you all know this, and you do it every day. From a research perspective, next slide, please. What's human connection? There are these ephemeral moments of when you're connecting, you can feel it, and it may be very resistant to studying it. So if we're going to try to observe what human connection looks like, sounds like, feels like, we're going to need places to start that we can get a toehold on measurement that we think we might be able to scale to large studies to begin to understand this phenomenon. And we start following plenty of work, next slide please, for a century or more in multiple sciences about how people interact in conversations. And Heidi Levitt and Tony Bach and Joseph Bartel's teams have all identified and described qualitatively types of pauses in conversations that represent more than the functional exchange between speaker turns. And something different than distraction or functional moments, but rather these eloquent, I like Joseph Bartel's use of that word, these eloquent silences. It's when you're not talking that you might be some of the juice of human connection that we can see, feel, and reliably measure. And so that's where we're going to focus, or where I'm going to focus the rest of this presentation, is on going after these pauses and silences. Is there a way that we can reliably find them? And do they seem to be associated with decision-making in some tangible way that might lead to further hypotheses that these are markers of human connection worth exploring further? Next slide. So the parent study from which this data arises is the Palliative Care Communication Research Initiative. Yes, I came up with that name myself. I'm doing it again next time. I'll probably enlist some better marketing folks with cooler names, but that's stuck. This is an observational multi-site cohort study. It took place in Rochester, New York, and San Francisco, California. There was no intervention other than what was naturally happening for palliative care consult with people who are hospitalized with stage 3 or 4 cancer. We excluded consultations from people who were admitted from hospice for symptom management or for whom the goals of care had already been sufficiently clarified that the reason for consultation was to enroll in hospice. And we do that primarily because the fundamental question for this parent study was about navigating some of the decision-making with respect to disease-focused treatments. Next slide, please. So the cohort study enrolled, well, it included 3 fundamental forms of data from which we analyzed outcomes. Some are self-report. We worked really hard to whittle this down to the amount of questions that seriously ill patients could answer and participate, because we did not want to select for people who had just more energy and missed the experience of people who were sicker. And we found this threshold of 20 questions was a really valuable one for people to think about whether participation was, they were able to participate or not. And 3 items from the clinicians. We had 6-month follow-up of health service utilization for medical record, and we observed and audio recorded up to the first 3 visits with the palliative care consult team in the hospital. Next slide, please. So the final sample was 240 patient participants, half of whom were women, 13% identified as Black or African American, 8% as Latinx or Hispanic, and about a third were younger than 55, about a third were over 75, and a third were in the middle. This is indicative of the referral populations at both our sites, and our enrollment our enrollment rates were very, very high. People very much wanted to participate in the study to understand communication. It also represented what we typically see for inpatient palliative care consultations, that about a quarter of these people live for for less than 2 weeks. About half of people live for just over 3 months, and a quarter of people live longer than 3 months. Very few people live for a year or longer. The study enrolled 54 palliative care specialty clinicians at both sites. This included 3 chaplains, 2 social workers, 2 RNs, 6 advanced practice RNs, 16 physician fellows, and 25 attending physicians in palliative care. Next slide. So the conversations of the 240 people, 9 were discharged or died, and 1 actually withdrew before a conversation was, before we recorded a conversation. And the person who withdrew from the study also withdrew because they canceled the palliative care consult, so there was none to observe regardless. This left 231 people with a recording of at least 1 conversation. 5 of those people were excluded because their conversations were sufficiently low quality audio that we could not reliably tell even when there were changes in speaker turns most of the time. And that was typically due to very high flow oxygen masks with people who were mouthing their words, and you could very barely hear them. So this is 226 conversations. Next slide. And so think about pauses and silences. How are we going to go about measuring these things, and particularly scaling them? And I mentioned it before, but pauses are fantastically interesting, I think, from a linguistics perspective, is that somehow we organize a conversation pretty efficiently around turn taking. Next slide. And that very rarely, really, do people interrupt substantially, but they take a very small amount of time between turns in order to structure a conversation. This is a graph of the milliseconds, the average amount of milliseconds between speaker turns using social conversations, not healthcare ones necessarily. In the English language, this is a large study done by Stivers et al. And finds that very rarely do conversations that pauses last longer than 2 seconds. And so 2 seconds becomes this threshold that lots of sciences use for a length of a pause between speaker turns that is something different. The next slide. The good thing about this as well is that conversational turn taking is also a near culturally ubiquitous phenomena, in that a 2-second threshold holds for most observed cultures and speaking and languages. There are some notable differences. I think one that isn't shown on this slide I would love to learn a little bit more about, but for example, the Navajo people tend to have a longer between turn taking pauses, but generally speaking, 2 seconds is a pretty common threshold. Next slide, please. So first steps in this process, we created a machine learning silence classifier, meaning we used 85 indices of sound that are really off-the-shelf measures that acoustic engineers have on hand about sound energy. And we classified and we showed the computer many examples of times when there's a silence or a pause and times when they're not. Now, the key here is that these were in the hospital environment, so a pause is not silent. We never actually found silence. There's always some sound. There are things going beep, there's a lot of ambient noise, there are other people talking in the hallway, there's radios and TVs on. So the fundamental problem that we needed to address was, can we identify a pause in the target conversation? And so we did that. And next slide. We trained the machine learning algorithm to overcall it, meaning if it was going to make an error, we did not want to miss a pause. We wanted to have the machine call it a pause when it really wasn't, and that we'd clean it up at the next step with the human coders. So this is an image of showing the longer the pauses, the closer or better the accuracy was. But around the 2-second break point, about of every 4 predicted pauses, between 1 and 1.5 were actually a real pause. So what we did next slide please, is that had student coders and our research assistants in our lab listened to these predicted silences and identified those that were indeed a pause for 2 seconds and those that were not. And we had very strict criteria on what vocal sounds constituted a pause, and we followed some of the linguistic rules around sounds that appear to be claiming the speaking floor and those that did not. And I can talk more about that in the Q&A if people wish, but this was a lot of work, and that the students also were looking at spectrograms. So they had visual cues and auditory cues to identify what were true 2-second pauses. We double coded every one of more than 20,000 predicted silences, and anytime there was a disagreement, we had a third coder adjudicate it. Next slide, please. What that left is in this data set, there were over 60,000 speaker turns. There were over 6,600 minutes of audio, and we identified and confirmed 6,769 silences. And this was more than 300 hours of human coding. And next slide, please. I don't know if anybody else has done coding like this, but that's about equivalent to 4.37 metric tons of chocolate that our lab provided for this. Financial reimbursement is not enough. That chocolate is the thing that helps keep our coders on task, keeps morale high, and keeps the outcomes going. And by several quasi-experimental designs, we also realized that Lake Champlain chocolate has the highest productivity to happiness ratio to any other chocolate out there. Lake Champlain being one of our local specialty chocolates. So although I tried to scale down the chocolate, it was certainly met with the response that got us back here. So anyone who wants Lake Champlain chocolate, let me know. We can send you a little bit to see how it helps your research teams. Next slide, please. So once we have the connectional silence, once we have all the confirmed silences present, we then double coded each one of those with the simple question, is this a connectional silence or is this not a connectional silence? So what did that mean? If it was a connectional silence, it was really one of two types. Next slide, please. We refer to these as an emotional connectional silence or an invitational connectional silence. Now these follow Tony Bach's conceptual model of silences that identify these two of three types, the third being an awkward or other functional types, but we're focusing on the connectional. So emotional connectional silence, next slide please, is a 2 or more second silence that follows a moment of gravity, marked by the expression of emotion or an affective cue that appears unpleasant to the speaker. So what do you mean by that? Here's a couple of examples. Next slide, please. So clinician. So it could be radiation effects still, or it could be the chemotherapy effect. Patient, yeah. Patient side, clinician acknowledges a lot going on. Patient, I'm really tired. Next slide, please. A different example. Patient and everything. So it's just hard. Clinician, you said that, not good news. Can you tell me, followed by more of a continuer type of statement. Next slide, please. So an invitational connectional silence is a different type of silence. And we define it as any silence that happens either directly after or during the response to a question relating to personal values or identity, quality of life, treatment hopes, goals or preferences, information needs or preferences, prognosis or death, dying. Any open-ended question that happens in a conversational context where those above topics are being discussed is also included. What this long list is trying to get at is we excluded questions that were seen more performative. Can you hand me that pencil? Even knowing, even some of those performative questions, there may be more to it than that, but we still excluded those to try to really zero in a little bit more on some of these types of connectional silences. So for example, next slide, please. Clinician, is there anything in particular today that you would like me to help you with? Patient, no. Now I'm going to stop at 5 seconds. For those of you who can do 11-second silence, you can all do it. This takes a lot to train a physician to do that. Patient then says, there was something. This also brings up an important thing. I use this example because it also clearly indicates there's something nonverbal going on here, that these people in conversation are cueing off of each other and allowing such that silence to be present. We don't have that accessible here, so we're going to be using the auditory, audible only data, but I want to at least acknowledge that here. Another example, prognosis and things like that too. You able to share, or patient? It's kind of hard. Clinician, yeah. Patient, but I'll try. So how common did this? How common were these silences in the conversations we had? Next slide, please. So among our nearly 7,000 pauses, 617 or 9% were definitely connectional, and we defined a definite connectional where both coders agreed. A possible connectional was where one coder called it connectional and one did not, and that was a little bit fewer, 8% of those. And the remainder were not connectional. I'm going to focus the rest of this talk on the definite connectional moments. Next slide, please. In the definite connectional silences, little over half of them were labeled as definitely emotional connectional silences. Almost 40% were labeled as definitely invitational. And then there was another group that were definitely connectional, but our coders disagreed on which type it was. Next slide, please. So at the conversation level, these rings now are 226 conversations. About 40%, a little over 40% of the conversations had at least one emotional connectional silence in it. Then almost 40% had at least one invitational connectional silence. 56% of conversations had at least one or the other, and 23% of conversations had both. Next slide, please. We can measure these epidemiologically as a rate, as well as how frequently were silences happening per minute of conversation, and they were between 20, about one silence every 20 to 25 minutes on average, and that's inclusive of conversations in which there were none. So I'm going to stick with the prevalence data and not return to rates, also because the story is nearly the same. Next slide, please. So the question then becomes, these are happening, we're finding them, are they associated with person-centered decision-making? And when I say person-centered, what I'm looking for is that these moments may be opportunities to learn about this human being, what matters to them, what suffering means, and in the context, how these decisions relate to their own personal identities and definitions. Next slide. So why might silence also capture that? Just fundamentally speaking, is that human connection can ease the terror of these experiences and can certainly ease, even temporarily, the existential loneliness of these types of conversations. It allows for system 2 cognitive processing time, meaning that system 1 being heuristics of the rapid judgments that we use gist and heuristic to make quick decisions, very helpful in times of threat. However, allowing space for the heavier lifting of the cognitive load requires a little bit of time, and that's referred to as system 2. It also allows conversation participants to express a non-confirmatory response. We answer more quickly when we agree with the previous speaker. Leaving space allows space for a disagreement. It also allows a shift in conversational focus, roles, and topics, frankly. I'll show you an example of that. So this is an example of an emotional connectional silence. During the 5 minutes before the pause, from a process perspective, there are 2 conversation speakers. The clinician is talking more than the patient. The clinician speaks on average more words per conversation turn, as well as dominating the information flow within the conversation. There are several occurrences of overlapping speech. Next slide, please. After the conversation, during the 5 minutes following the pause, the patient speaks on average longer per turn. The patient initiates the direction of the conversation and dominates the information flow. The clinician adds minimal information to the conversation. Instead, the clinician reiterates and supports the patient's statements with a few prompting questions. There are no occurrences of overlapping speech. Next slide. And from a topic perspective, before the pause, the clinician is explaining treatment options for neuropathic pain and asking the patient about her symptoms. The conversation revolves around levels and location of pain and subsequent pain management. Medications are suggested for future use, and the conversation leans toward the effects of previous sessions of radiation. The entirety of the 5 minutes discusses pain and pain management. After the pause, the next slide, please. The focus of the conversation pivots towards individual experiences and emotions, as well as the contemplation of personal values. The patient expresses frustration and cites the support of friends in her church as making the process easier for her. The patient expresses a positive outlook as being a primary aim. There's no further mention of treatment from the clinician during this time. So every participant in the study, we also identified and classified the status of their decisions about disease-focused treatments. And we put those into 3 kind of buckets that are pretty commonly acculturated in healthcare context. One is that there's no limitations to what would be an acceptable type of disease treatment for someone who is ill. One might be limited some limitations, meaning, you know what, I'd accept some types of treatments, but not others. Oftentimes those limitations are around emergency events, such as cardiopulmonary resuscitation attempts. And then there's another group that we call comfort-directed or exclusively comfort-directed treatment, that all the decisions that we're making should be focused on whether this is adding to your quality of life, not whether this is managing the disease or longevity. For the sake of time, I'll just acknowledge we identified before and after the consultation the status of these decisions, one by extensive review of the medical record and all the places that can be documented, and after the consultation by the clinician who'd been having the conversation. Next slide. Here's what we saw. 30% of the participants in our study had a shift in decisional status following the initial consultation with the palliative care team. Of those 67 people, the vast majority, the shift was away from disease-focused management and more towards comfort-focused management, and I'll call that with more limits. There were some, 6, where the shift was away from a comfort-focused decisional context, more towards a disease-focused with fewer limits. Next paragraph. Next slide, please. To try to get a little bit at not just whether a decision happened or seemed to happen, but did it seem to reflect what this person's hopes were or their values. Dr. Sanders is among the world leaders in identifying and naming the problem that identifying treatment preferences is very, very challenging. These are dynamic, they're situational dependent. Having said that, we, like others, measured at the beginning of the study, before the consultation, people's preferences for disease treatment. During the last few months of my life, I would prefer a plan of treatment that focused on my comfort and quality of life, even if that meant not living quite as long. This is Jane Weeks and others have developed this during the support study in the 90s, and many have used this as an item for this. You'll see from the donut here, this is a pretty common distribution in seriously ill people, is that the majority endorse a shift towards a comfort-directed plan closer to the end of their life. Some do not, and many, up to a quarter to a third, are unsure about how to answer that question. Next paragraph, next slide, please. When looking at, I looked directionally at the decision to place more limits. And we did that because there were too few observations, number 6 observations in people who had fewer limits, to do this meaningfully and stably. Also because our treatment preference question was directional towards comfort as well. So if we look at our conversations in which there was an invitational or emotional silence were more likely to precede a decisional shift towards a comfort-directed plan of care. The emotional, next slide please, the statistical significance of the emotional connectional silence was greater than the invitational, but the direction was quite similar. Next slide. But what we'll want to know is not just among everybody, but did that association between the connectional silence, did it map onto these preferences in some way that might give us a sense that those silences are associated with more clarity about what matters to this person? So if we look at the people who were indicated in agreement towards more limitations to disease-focused treatments, those in the blue, next slide please. Indeed, the associations that we saw, these are odds ratios, are stronger. So the farther you get from 1 in an odds ratio, the stronger the association between the connectional silence and the decisional status is. In comparison, when we look at the people who are either unsure or disagreed with that statement, next slide please, it was close to 1, which means that the association between the presence of a silence and a decision to limit the types of treatments was likely absent, thus supporting that the stratification of these effects was related to some of the preferences that patients stated before these conversations. Next slide, please. So what do we take away from this? So one is that connectional silence do indeed happen frequently in special serious illness conversations, and that we can find them. that emotional connectional silence is associated with changes in decisional status, and that the preferences for end-of-life medical treatment do appear to demonstrate patterns with the association of decision status and connectional silences that supports the patient-centeredness of this direction. Next slide. Here are substantial limitations to the work that I presented. One is that, despite good representation of our referral populations, we still had insufficient variation in cultural and linguistic backgrounds of our speakers. We had insufficient variation in the cultural and linguistic backgrounds of our coders to identify whether connection is happening. The treatment preferences, as I mentioned before, are dynamic, and they're challenging to characterize effectively in epidemiological studies. So identifying what are goal consistent and values consistent decisions is a terribly hard thing to do, but worth continued effort. Next slide. Where to from here? We're focusing on some of the measurement fairness, the cultural variation, and how connection manifests through pauses and silences and how we code them. We're doing more analyses of how context, how situational and cultural context modifies the association between silence and outcomes. And we're working to establish a more robust taxonomy of silences through combination of machine learning and qualitative methods that I'm happy to describe more if people wish. Next slide. And I'd like to express my gratitude to all of you for listening to me, for transforming chaplaincy, for inviting me and Dr. Sanders to be here, to the patients and families and clinicians who really made this possible, and my teammates and funders who just really were fundamental to this process. And I'm very grateful, and thank you for listening.
Thank you, Dr. Gramling. You set up quite a buffet there. And Dr. Sanders, so much gratitude for you as well for joining us here to respond to be the discussant. And I didn't know, lots of stuff to chew on there from Dr. Gramling, but I don't know if that walk-up song possibility still, was generated within you. But would love to hear that if you have it.
Yeah, well, I won't sing it to you like I did to my wife at our wedding, but I'm gonna go with Sweet Caroline because that was a song that I sang to my wife at her wedding. Her name is Caroline. She was named after that song in part. And also it happens to be, of course, one of the songs that they play at every seventh inning of the Red Sox baseball game. So wow. I thought that might be appropriate.
Oh, man, I think you checked all the boxes on that one. All right, thank you. I'm going to go silent again. I'll see you in a little while.
All right, well, I just want to say thank you so much to the organizers and to Bob for the invitation to comment on the fascinating work that you've heard about today. I think we're really lucky to hear about this work because it is in many ways groundbreaking. I really want to commend Bob publicly for his creativity and rigor in conducting this research and in presenting this work. It's really a treat to see. So my reflections on this are grounded in my experience as a clinician and as a person who's trained hundreds of clinicians of all types in the use of tools and frameworks to improve serious illness communication. And I'd like to take the construct of connectional silence and break it apart for a moment, starting with the silence. So silence is something I talk a lot about when teaching physicians in practice and trainees about serious illness communication. In my mind, it can be useful to think about two broad kinds of silence, which align with but are also a little bit different conceptually from the silences outlined by Dr. Gramling and those whom he referenced. And I'm thinking about silences as unintentional and intentional. I think of unintentional silences as the result of not knowing what to say. And for medical and nursing trainees, they often result when a heuristic for clinical interviewing is underdeveloped or rigid and unresponsive to the twists and turns of a natural conversation. These are sometimes awkward silences, and Bob highlighted that word. They're ones that patients, sensing that awkwardness, will often try to fill. And intentional or perhaps connectional silences, by contrast, are those about which we carry an awareness of their potential utility. So these silences, I tell trainees, are among the most powerful forms of nonverbal empathic communication. The opposite of those who talks lots and say a little, they're moments in which no talking says everything. and they create or contribute to a shared space of understanding. I think of them as analogous in some way to diastole, so when the heart chamber refills, or inhalation when the lungs refill, which are important in the way that without them, there's really no life. And these types of silence are familiar to chaplains and clergy, I think. Chaplains are used to sitting with people and doing so in silence. You recognize the power of silence in ways that clinicians very often do not. And I was struck by Bob saying about how that 11 seconds is a threshold that is very hard for clinicians to achieve. One of the most important potential outcomes of Dr. Gramling's work, in my mind, is the need to show that silence exists in different ways and has outcomes that matter to patients and those that care for them. There is in the health sciences only a minor literature on connection and relationships, and I find this surprising given how important these relationships appear to be. Anthony Suchman was a leading voice in this body of work, and in a 1993 paper in the Annals of Medicine, he and his colleagues wrote about connectional experiences, and they proposed this neologism that resulted from the combination of co, meaning together, and nexus, meaning a drawing together of parts to form a whole. So he in fact spelled it with an X instead of a T, or a CT as it were. So they write in this paper that the therapeutic nature of the patient-clinician relationship lies in its capacity to meet the needs of both the patient and the clinician for connection and meaning in their lives. These needs are met through a transpersonal and spiritual dimension of medical care that is most readily recognized in occasional moments of particular closeness during medical encounters. These moments, they continue, are marked by a physiologic reaction such as goose flesh or a chill, by an immediacy of awareness of the patient's situation, by a sense of being part of a larger whole, and by a lingering feeling of joy, peacefulness, and awe. And I imagine that that type of connection feels familiar to many of you. It certainly feels familiar to me as a clinician. So they go on to propose strategies for creating a favorable climate of connection with an X. And these include establishing rapport, accessing unconscious process, and silencing internal talk. And I reordered them a little bit from their initial paper. But the first, this establishing rapport, involves something of a more proactive process in my mind that involves questioning, observing, and mirroring. The second, accessing unconscious process, involves deep listening for the small cues that patients may share and that may hold meaning for what is happening in their subconscious. They make the analogy of like a Rorschach test in some ways, and connect it to some of the work that is done in psychoanalytic processes. And then there is silencing internal talk. And they write, quote, "First, as the patient begins to relate his story, it is necessary to silence our own internal talk, that part of consciousness that is already forming the next comment, question, or criticism, even as the patient is still speaking." They continue, "With internal talk silenced, we find more freedom in our awareness." Now, this makes me think that there may be a relationship between our ability to quiet our inner voices with the awareness that allows us to cultivate connectional silence with patients, either connectional with an X or connectional with a CT, as was presented here. And I don't want to go too far off base with my comments. I think that writing like this does is give us many more questions and some different lenses through which to view Dr. Gramling's lab's work. So if the work presented today is concerned with differentiating silences and understanding their association with certain outcomes, then I think a next level of questioning would lead us to try to figure out just what is going on in the minds of those involved prior to their occurrence, that is their precipitants, as well as what is felt in those moments themselves. And there's an opportunity, I'm suggesting, to link the literature on relationships with the literature that derives from linguistic analysis like that which Dr. Gramling presented. So an audience of chaplains and chaplain researchers certainly did not need Dr. Gramling's research to suggest to them the value of silence. right? But I sense a wonderful parallel in the ways in which you explore with patients the meaning in that which cannot be seen, while this work tries to understand the meaning in that which cannot be heard. So I'll leave you with that. I don't know if I went up to 10 minutes. I probably didn't. I would add, my own curiosity, in understanding some of these inflection points in conversations. And you illustrated that so beautifully with the example, Bob, about what happens in silence in terms of its transition to a new point in the conversation that I think of as much more relational in its content. So anyway, wonderful talk, and thank you for the opportunity to reflect.
Thank you, Dr. Sanders. Yeah, I'm sure, Dr. Gramling, you got, obviously you get the first, for a conversation with Dr. Sanders, and then we can head to some questions. I think you're obviously somebody who collects data. If you're in touch with the Lake Chaplain people, I'm guessing they're going to see a bump in their spreadsheet based upon your endorsement of the good chocolate. I'm gonna have to look at their website, but for now, I'd love to hear you and Dr. Graham and Dr. Sanders talk, and then we'll take some questions from those who are kindly with us as well.
Well, I just love listening to Dr. Sanders speak. I mean, both the words and how the meaning you conveyed, Justin, I really just find super effective and inspiring, and I'm just thankful. I also think as an educator, one of the things that I've bumped, because I mentioned that 11-second silence, and you've mentioned the silence, and oftentimes people will ask me, hey, do you teach physicians to be silent? I say, well, if you look at where silence is trained in other disciplines, negotiators are trained to use silence. Hostage negotiators. I mean, silence can be used in very powerful ways for healthful, spiritually connective reasons, and also for somewhat manipulative ones that are directional. And so I don't know how you have been able to, how you handle that in your teaching, but I loved how you were describing to your learners about what silence can do, because I've often lacked that language, and so I'm going to borrow it, because I do want people to also have the situational and personal awareness so that they know that this is something powerful, and there's a time for it and there's a time not for it.
Yeah, that's so interesting. I think a lot about what I'm trying to cultivate in learners in palliative care, since that's where I most encounter them, is about cultivating a sixth sense about what's happening in a conversation as they're in it. And as if in some ways they were like a fly on the wall of their own conversation. And it involves this sort of meta activity of awareness in which you're aware of what you're feeling in yourself. You have a sense or hypotheses about what someone else is feeling, and including, in a family meeting, for instance, all the other people in the room. And it is a skill that I think we can cultivate over time. And I think part of it is thinking about what are these different elements of conversations that we can employ intentionally, both, things that we explicitly say, so lexical content, as you would say, I know, or the words that come out of our mouth, or how we deploy a nonverbal communication in order to accomplish certain aims, certainly. But I think what I've come to really emphasize in my own thinking is about the value and the relationships we build. Because, I think that what's true of palliative care clinicians, what's true of all clinicians who care for people with serious illness, and what's true for the people who are attending this webinar, is that, and I think this relates to what you said at the beginning, around suffering. There is, in some senses, there will always be suffering, right? And there is some amount of suffering that we will never be able to completely address. But the way in which we can concurrently promote healing, even in spite of suffering, is by enhancing people's meaning in life. And part of the way we do that is through enhancing connections with them and relationships. And I think that some of the people I respect most in our own medical literature are those who write about the importance of these connections in terms of helping people, exist in the world no matter what happens, with meaning and with integrity. So that's where I, think this conversational work is so important. We could talk all day about this. I feel like it's
We should. I think
Yeah,
it's Sweet
I've never
Caroline too in between.
Yeah, because I've never felt so good, so good. So I'm going to see how many of these questions we can get through in the last couple of minutes. So I'm enjoying this a lot. So any hypotheses, guesses, perhaps, as to why the emotional connectional silence was associated with changes, but invitational silences were not?
So thank you for the lovely question. It also, I'm trained as an epidemiologist, which I don't tend to pivot on the p-value quite as much, meaning that I'm looking for a stable estimate. I would propose that our observations suggest that both do. One just surpasses our level of accepted precision before we go with the hypothesis that it does something. Now, I'm not naive to our whole scientific culture, and I need to exist within that and honor it. So it's easier to conclude something that has surpassed that threshold, like the emotional connectional silence did, but I think they both do. And one thing I didn't present here is that the invitational connectional silence was associated with some of an important thing that we oftentimes face is a wide discordance between clinicians' expectations for survival prognosis and patients' expectations for survival prognosis. And the fact that conversations where invitational connectional silence was present versus absent were characterized by more of that discordance, to me says this is actually potentially a very important piece of the decision-making conversation that's allowing space to let people contemplate that potential differences. Anyway, so thank you for that question.
No, thanks. Dr. Sanders, anything more on that too that you might gesture?
No, I think it makes sense that silence opens up the kind of space where people can engage more authentically in conversations. And I think that for me, like this idea of authentic healing relationships are really aided by silence in some way. And I think we see that in the data there. So it doesn't surprise me that it creates new space in conversations for people's concerns, new qualities of the conversation that would be more likely to inform those kinds of decisions after.
Thank you. Unlike hostage negotiators.
I'm sorry to even introduce such a violent type of image in the conversation today, but I just want to acknowledge that silence has very different purposes.
You know, it is. My sister's a retired police officer, so I can, you know, the importance of their work. So the question is, how can chaplains best support medical clinicians in facilitating these intentional connectional silences?
I can take a stab at that. You know, I think that it makes me think about the importance of working as interprofessional teams in the hospital, and I think there are ways in which we can, you know, I learn from being with my own chaplaincy colleagues in, you know, the places where I've worked about the value of silence, and in part because they demonstrate it very well. And so when I go to see a patient with a chaplain, I'm almost certain that I'm more likely to use silence in some way, or at least participate in a useful silence, let's say. Certainly, I know chaplains who, you know, who are not as comfortable with silence as others, but I think that there's ways in which, you know, offering to accompany clinicians and not just the patients in your visits is a really powerful way of aligning with patients and also, you know, using silence in ways that clinicians may not find intuitive when they're there by themselves.
Yeah, Justin, and you mentioned something that you do, and I think I gravitated to doing it as well, which is, I think, really interesting here, is that when I come out of the room with a learner or someone who's willing to engage in a kind of a curiosity type of conversation, is we spend time just saying, what was happening in there? What did you notice? Just,
Yeah.
what was not what was good, not what was bad, or not what you wish you did, but just what was happening. And so after doing that a bunch of times with people, they start to get it that, oh, paying attention to situational awareness is what Gramling's going to ask me when I come out of the room. So let's just pay attention to stuff. So I think any of my colleagues on the team whom I'm with, and we ask each other what was happening, it's so fun to hear when people are hearing or seeing something that I was hearing it differently, or I missed that, or I'm going to pay attention, I'm going to tune a little bit differently next time. So I think helping each other tune is a super valuable thing, and our chaplaincy colleagues do this magnificently.
We so appreciate your kind words. There's a question here. We're at the top of the hour, so I know I need to conclude this. But Dr. Sanders, you mentioned an article. Somebody was asking about the title. We can send it out. We send like a post kind of follow-up from that, so that whoever asked that question, great question, because I was curious about that as well. But we'll get maybe a DOI for you on that as well. Do you want to say it out loud right now?
Yeah, I can say it. I have it right here actually. So it's called Making Connections with an X and in quotations, enhancing the therapeutic potential of patient-clinician relationships. And the first author is actually Dale Matthews. And but I'm happy to share. I'm happy to share it. It's actually available as open access on the web, so I can share it with you.
Thank you so much. Really, this has been quite the experience, and I hate to end this party. Thanks to all of you who joined us. Thanks to Andy. Thanks to Dr. Fichette as well for helping us kick this off. Friends, we hope to see you again. Our next webinar is going to feature Dr. Lexi Torkey from Indiana University on some amazing RCT that she has done in her setting. So stay tuned. That's in late May. But again, for now, thank you, Dr. Gramling. Thank you, Dr. Sanders. It was a pleasure to have you among us and share your wisdom.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thanks for your work, everybody.
Bye.